Hi, everyone. This is Aaron Larson, executive editor of Power Magazine, and I'm joined today by Sonal Patel, our senior editor, and Darrell Proctor, our senior editor at Power. Um, we're going to do a quick overview of the January 2025 issue of the magazine, which is our industry forecast issue. And we do that every year to kind of give a broad look at what's happening in the industry and where it's going and what we think is important in the coming year and beyond. So, Sonal, would you talk a little bit about the trends that you identified from the International Energy Agency's report?
Sure. The International Energy Agency puts out this massive report every October. And so, for the most part, the outlook is for the next 5 years, so toward 2030, which makes it very interesting given all the uncertainties that we have and we're facing as a sector. And I think that one of the biggest findings that had, which is no surprise to anyone, is that we're looking at this massive projected surge in power demand. And this is a global surge that they're talking about. But it's very different in different regions. And I think in many parts of the world, that surge is going to be driven by heating and cooling and electric vehicles. For example, in China, there's going to be also a surge in demand from hydrogen production. In the advanced economies, which is most of the Western world, that is going to be from data centers and digitalization. The other trends that we talk about in this article are that obviously policy momentum is helping to promote renewables, and it will have deep implications for fossil fuels, including coal and natural gas and oil.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the natural gas aspect because you've got strong opinions on where natural gas is going, right, Darrell?
Everyone that I'm talking to, and this is not really anything that is new, other than the fact that natural gas probably is the fuel with the best prospects moving forward. And that's because a lot of companies have already announced, hey, we're going to build new gas-fired power plants to literally serve data centers and data centers only, although also, obviously any excess power would be sent to the grid. In the U.S., just as an example, because of the abundance of domestically produced natural gas, the U.S. now the world's, and for the past few years, the world's largest oil and gas producer. It makes it a cheaper fuel, certainly far more cost competitive than coal at this point. Nobody's going to look at building a new coal plant in the U.S., but gas plants, recent reports said there are 200 units or more already in the planning and design stages that we're going to see. I mean, Entergy building 3 units and with 2.2 gigawatts of generation just to serve data centers in Louisiana. So we're going to see a lot more of that, for the incoming Trump administration. And we do, touch on this in several of the articles we've been writing. And again, in the January issue as part of the forecast, what is the regulatory environment going to look like? Sonal touched on that. Is it probably going to support more fossil fuel, not only fossil fuel production, but more fossil fuel power generation? And what does that mean for renewables? We've had tremendous growth in solar power. The expectation is that will continue, although it may slow. Wind power, very uncertain, certainly offshore wind in the U.S. Trump has already said, hey, I'm going to kill offshore wind on day one. We'll see what happens there. Geothermal, I think, has a lot of promise. And oil and gas companies are also going to get involved in the geothermal sector. So that's something to definitely keep an eye on.
And I guess going back to you're talking about solar power, and in my article on the industry forecast look ahead, one of the things that was reported in there is that the worldwide outlook from a BMI Fitch Solutions report suggests that growth will continue at 12% per year over the next decade, with most of that growth happening in Asia Pacific region, including China being the major driver there, but India and Japan as well. So I think we're seeing a lot of growth in America, but we're also seeing it worldwide, and I think that's important to recognize going forward as well. And you mentioned the changes expected in the Trump administration. We know that the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, is not likely to be completely repealed, but there may be some changes made within that law that could affect renewables, could affect other things that promote potentially some of the gas development that you were talking about. So, Sonal, do you have any other things to add that you'd like to mention?
Sure. I think some of the trends that the reports that we've been putting out have been highlighting have been, particularly in the last 2 months, is this mounting pressure to sustain adequate supply, and specifically to make sure that peaking resources are adequate, right? So we want to make sure that when demand is high, we have the right amount of power to meet it. And there is quite a lot of information that some of these reports have been focusing on in terms of how there will be a growing role for different types of solutions like demand response solutions and smart meters, demand shifting appliances from the demand side. But for the most part, it seems that natural gas and coal plants and their dispatchable capacity will still be, major players on the horizon. And then the last one is the supply chain risks, which is essentially a major concern for the power industry. These risks, they extend to the full chain in terms of all components that we use for power. For solar PV, for electrolyzers, for battery components. And a key thing that we're looking at in 2025, maybe going forward, is critical minerals and where those markets will stabilize, because they were extremely turbulent that they have been over the last two years or so. So where's our copper going to be coming from? The lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite. And that is a kind of a really big concern, given that we're looking at this massive infrastructure build out, including for transmission and generation.
Darrell, I'd like you to talk a little bit about an article you wrote on Amazon and some wind farms that they're putting in, particularly in this case in Greece, but elsewhere as well.
So one of the trends that we're seeing is these large, particularly tech companies, wanting to ensure they have a good supply 24/7 of power, and also want to control their energy costs. And in some cases, when you have a company like an Amazon or a Google or a Meta that also has sustainability targets, they're looking at renewable energy to fulfill some of the targets they have that they need the new generation. So what was happening in Greece, Amazon has PPAs with 3 solar power installations, which will serve their operations in Greece. And that's just one example. We're seeing a lot of these type of things with the technology companies. We're going to see more of it. I think that, one of the arguments that people have in terms of infrastructure upgrades and who's going to pay for this new generation, and the thinking is that more and more it's going to fall upon the companies that actually need the generation. They're going to be tasked with having to pay for it, either through by setting up a PPA or literally paying to build the infrastructure, or in some cases having to deal with tariffs from different utilities and power companies who say, we want you to be paying for the power that you're using. We do not want to have to pass those increases on to the rest of our customer base.
Yeah. And I wanted to bring up an article also that I worked on for the January issue about nuclear power and the war in Ukraine. I had the opportunity to hear Director General Rafael Mariano Grossi from the International Atomic Energy Agency speak in Orlando. That was in November, and he talked about how uh, difficult it is to monitor all of the uh, nuclear safety aspects at power plants within war zones, specifically the Zaporizhia plant and others in Ukraine. You know, they have people on the ground monitoring these sites 24/7. Basically, they are constantly getting updates and trying to maintain safety with war basically right at the front lines there. So it's a very difficult process, and it's very important for the industry uh, to keep these plants safe. And it's definitely a concern and something that the nuclear world needs to stay on top of in order to uh, prevent a catastrophe or a disaster. So that's another article that people can check out in the January issue. I guess lastly, Sonal, would you talk a little bit about your transformer article that you wrote, specifically touches on solid state transformers and the benefits that they provide to the industry?
Sure. This is kind of an emerging technology. So the article essentially explores the prospects, the trends driving this type of R&D. It is really in the early stages of R&D at this point, but it is starting to make a little bit of an impact given commercial interest, investor interest. So the article looks deeply into how it works and who the main players are at this point, and how it could affect a renewable integration and more a communicative grid, which is what we need as the transition gains pace.
Yeah, I found that really to be an interesting article, and I learned a lot from it. So thanks for writing that. And Darrell, one last article that you worked on was the distributed energy uh, topic. Can you touch on some of the takeaways from that article?
Well, partly it goes back to what Sonal said there with communication with the grid, because as more renewable energy and more DERs come into play, there needs to be a better way to integrate all of this into the power grid. Now, a lot of DERs obviously are behind the meter. And what we're seeing there is with virtual power plants, utilities are wanting to set up these virtual power plants, an aggregation of DERs across neighborhoods or regions. uh, it's very cost effective for the utility because they can have enough power generated from the DERs, even at the residential level, to avoid having to build a new power plant, even a peaker plant in a specific area to handle the load. You're going to hear a lot more about VPPs. They've been sort of trickling out over the past few years. A lot more utilities are looking at ways to bring those online, and we now have, I don't want to call it a cottage industry, but in fact, you have a lot of companies who are specifically coming into business simply to aggregate these DERs and the virtual power plants for utility customers. And it's one of the areas that maybe doesn't get talked about as much as it probably should, but we're going to see more of that as we move forward.
Great. Thanks, Darrell. And in the January issue, we've also got a Marnie Surfaceblow article. For those that may not be familiar with that, she's a fictional character who solves engineering problems at power plants, usually in a very unique way. So I'd encourage people to check that out. We also have a waste to energy article about passive heat that's heating and cooling a museum in Germany. And there's an article on mobile solutions for transforming utility network operations. And so, again, some great information in the January issue of Power Magazine. And also a commentary piece on critical role engineers and STEM educators play in addressing climate change challenges. That was submitted by an expert who is Shay Baramirid. She is the works at Pacific Gas and Electric (PG&E), and is also involved with the IEEE Power and Energy Society. So, with that, I think we've covered most of the issue, and I hope people will check it out. Thanks, everyone.